So before we dive into some of these categories on the gradient scale, I wanted to do a little bit of review. This is what we had done the first day of class before school was shut down and we all were sent home because of the whole COVID-19 coronavirus thing. And we talked about the evolution of the insanity defense. What does it mean to be criminally insane? Like we had talked about, it is a legal distinction or definition. This is legal vocabulary. It is not psychological vocabulary. It's not scientific vocabulary. This is a legal term to determine if this type of defense is going to work for you, because that's what it is in the courtroom. Is it is a defense that you're going to use to answer to a crime. In these cases, it's going to be murder. That's the main type of crime we're going to be looking at. And you can say that you were insane at the time, that you, because of some sort of mental illness, you were not responsible for what you were doing, or you were in some sort of dissociative state, that you didn't even know that it was going on. Usually teams of experts are called, and you have medical professionals, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, all as expert testimony in these cases. And it's a very, very, very small amount of people that use this defense, and an even smaller amount of people that are actually found to be insane or incapable of standing trial or not responsible for what they did. And it's changed over time. So that's what I want to look at mostly, is how it's evolved from the beginnings of this country to some of the things we're dealing now, because they're very, very different. So the first case that we have is Richard Lawrence, and this is in 1835. Andrew Jackson is president. We don't have cars, we don't have motorcades, there's not a secret service that's protecting the president at all times. He's a lot easier to get to than today, or it's almost impossible to get near the president, especially if you're trying to do something like assassinate him. So during this attempt on the president's life, it was a moist day, it was very humid outside, and he was waiting for Andrew Jackson to come out of a funeral, and he's hiding behind a pillar. He has 2 flintlock pistols in his possession. Now these pistols they use a musket ball, they have a bag of powder that goes inside, so you stick the powder in first in the musket ball, and it has a hammer that hits a piece of flint, that's why they call it a flintlock, and that sends a spark onto the powder bag, which then expels the musket ball as a projectile. And they were very, very susceptible to moisture, and because this is a humid day, it's very moist outside, the first pistol actually doesn't fire. He pulls it out, points it at the president, and click, it doesn't do anything. So he pulls out his other pistol, does the exact same thing. He points it at the president, Andrew Jackson, fires it, click, it does nothing. So Andrew Jackson, with the personality that he had, saw that this was happening, and he took out his cane and began to beat Mr. Richard Lawrence in the middle of the street. It's a very different time, a different place than we live in today, but apparently cane floggings happened not only by the president on the middle of the street, that happened on the Senate floor with a little bit more frequency than you would think it would. So when Richard Lawrence was immediately arrested and put on trial, they had expert witnesses coming in. They were medical experts, they were doctors, to attest that this guy is just mad, he's out of his mind, he's insane. Within 5 minutes, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. This is the first instance of this in the United States. So when he was testifying, when he gave his reason for why he wanted to assassinate the president, it is because he is the King of England. Not that Jackson's the King of England, but Richard Lawrence himself is the King of England, and Jackson being President of the United States, his policies and the things that he is doing are in his way and keeping him from receiving his royal dowry or his tribute or the money, the lifestyle that a king should be living. So he's institutionalized. He is kept there for the remainder of his life, and that is our first instance of legal insanity finding its way into the courtrooms of the United States. Our next case comes to us almost 100 years later after the assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson. This is at a time when technology is much more advanced. Psychology is becoming a true science of its own. They're not practicing phrenology anymore. It's not based on racism or anything else. It is actually becoming a true science among not only the scientific community but the public itself. So this man, Steven Steinberg, lives in Scottsdale, Arizona. He has a history of sleepwalking. And one day during these fits, or one evening during these times of him sleepwalking, he walks into the kitchen, grabs a kitchen knife, and stabs his wife 26 times. Now, he acknowledged that there was a murder and that he was probably the one that did it, but he says he doesn't remember any of it because at the time of it happening, he was sleepwalking and therefore he was not sane. At the trial, there was a doctor, an expert witness, Martin Blinder. He's a psychiatrist in the state of California. He testifies that the murder was committed under what he called a scenario of dissociative reaction. That, yes, he committed the murder, but he wasn't present in his body at the time, so therefore he is not responsible for what happened. So he entered the plea of not guilty because he claimed he did not remember the crime. He was asleep while it was happening, and the jury bought it. They found him innocent. They acquitted him on the grounds that he was temporarily insane, and that day he walked away a free man. Our next case is a turning point for a lot of things. A lot of people attribute the 24-hour news cycle that we have to this incident that happened with John Hinckley. It definitely changed the public's view of what insanity in criminal activity is, what that looks like in a courtroom, and who qualifies for it and who doesn't, because there was a massive public outcry about this particular case. Now, John Hinckley, he was a musician. He was kind of an artistic type of person, and he had an overwhelming obsession with the movie Taxi Driver. More importantly, with Jodi Foster's role in Taxi Driver, and he fell so madly in love with her that it became his only obsession, and he needed to get her interest any way that he could. He went to great lengths as far as actually taking a course at Yale that he knew that Jodi Foster was taking to be around her. He was calling her, sending her letters, writing her songs. He has an album. You can look it up and find it. It's in the public domain. But none of that stuff was working out for him. He was not capturing her interest the way that he felt that he should, that he was entitled to. So he needed to do something big that she would remember him for the rest of her life for. And the biggest thing he could think of was to assassinate the President of the United States. Now, the president at this time was Ronald Reagan. He was an actor. He was a very, very popular president. His constituency loved him. The American people loved him. and Hinckley attempting to assassinate him is not going to go over well with the people. So he jumped out as Reagan was getting into a car, and he shot Ronald Reagan. He was immediately carted off to the hospital. Reagan ultimately recovered. He didn't die from it, but Hinckley was arrested and put on trial for attempted murder. So in the courtroom, they told this story of this love-sick, obsessed person and pled insanity, and the news cameras are rolling the entire time watching this, and he gets a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. He's put into a psychiatric facility. He was actually let out in 2016 and is a free man today. But this really angered the American people. There was huge public outcry. A new law came into being because of this. The Reform Act of 1984 made it a lot more difficult to get off or to actually even qualify for an insanity plea. And it's going to make the punishment for insanity a lot different than going to a mental institution or being let out at some time in your life. Some of these sentences are going to be very, very long and require a lot different treatment than it has in the past. So the act actually required that there's a presence of a detrimental mental illness, and that it actually made the person incapable of knowing right and wrong. And there has to be some sort of expert that has seen this person, that there's an actual diagnosis, that there was medication, that there's some sort of history of mental illness going on. And this is the only defense that shifts the burden of proof from the prosecution, because in the United States you're innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof, if you're going to use insanity as a defense, shifts to the defense. So you're saying, yes, I committed this crime, but I am not responsible for it because I have a debilitating mental illness. So now it becomes the defense's responsibility to prove that this mental illness exists, and that the responsibility is not with their client because of said disability. Now, it was a combination of things. It's not just the Insanity Defense Reform Act of 1984, the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. There was a huge expanse in journalism overnight. All of these three-letter networks, ABC, NBC, they had news on 24 hours a day after the Hinckley incident. So the American people are becoming a lot more informed. They have access to a lot of stories and a lot of information that they didn't have before. Technology is advancing at an extremely rapid rate throughout the 80s and especially the 90s. So a lot of things that have always been there are coming into light. People are starting to know about these things when before they would just be ignorant. If you don't know what's happening, then in your world it doesn't happen. But now, because of the technological revolution and because of our ability to know about things that are going on all across the world, then it is going on in our world. So in the early 90s, this wasn't the first serial killer, but it's definitely one of the most notable that everybody knows about, and it was the most shocking thing that the American people had seen on TV. It scared everybody, and it is going to change the way that people look at what the term insanity is, what the definition of insanity is, what a criminal that is insane does, what his motives are, what his methods are, and the way that they operate. There have always been serial killers and multiple murders and very bad people in the world, but as technology advances, as police work advances, as DNA tests start to happen, as public knowledge of everything becomes greater and greater, we start to know more about these types of people. Now, in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of people that were arrested for serial killing. John Wayne Gacy was one of them. Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, Ted Bundy, all of these people were serial killers, and they were horrific in their own right. But this is the one that happens after the Hinckley incident, and Jeffery Dahmer encapsulated every aspect that you could think of that would personify what people would know as evil. It's shocking, it's horrific, and it's all on TV for the American people to watch. So a lot of his crimes, they involved necrophilia, having sexual relations with the corpse that you killed and mutilated, cannibalism, actually eating the flesh of the people that you've killed, and then collecting parts of the people, especially the bones, like the skulls, trying to preserve pieces of your victim. Now, Dahmer was actually plagued by mental illness. He had borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, a psychotic disorder. He had been diagnosed and seen psychiatrists throughout his life. He had had a lot of problems before, but he was actually found sane to stand trial when he was in the courtroom. He ended up being convicted of 15 of the 16 murders that he was facing charges for, and then later he was found guilty for another one. He was given a life sentence for each one of these. He never served them because he was beaten to death in jail by a fellow inmate. This is ended up with a lot of prison reform because of it, trying to segregate these types of criminals from the general population of prisoners in a facility. We're going to talk more about Dahmer and about all of the rest of them later as we get deeper into the scale of evil and deeper into the class, but this is a good time to mention him for the insanity defense. He did not qualify for it. So now we move away from the serial killers, the individual acts of terrorism and horror that they would do. We know a lot about the serial killers because we've arrested and tried and interviewed a lot of them. We've put them through scientific testing, MRIs, lie detector tests, all sorts of different things that we've been able to do to try to dissect the mind of the serial killer. Mass shooters are a different story. They are a very mysterious group of people because most of them don't survive the attack that they're doing. Whatever they had planned, they planned on dying during the act. And James Holmes is no different. He is the Aurora, Colorado movie theater mass shooter. He had no criminal background. It's a little fascinating. He comes from a very affluent family, had college-educated parents. He's college-educated himself. He has a bachelor's degree in neuroscience with the highest honors. He has a 3.95 GPA. Any test that he'd ever taken, he was up in the 90-something percentile. He's an extremely intelligent individual, working professionally in academia and trying to achieve higher and higher degrees and honors in academia. So it's very surprising that he comes from that demographic and then ends up doing something like he did. So he went in through the emergency exit of the movie theater and began shooting people. He killed 12 people. He injured 70 others in the darkness and the chaos. He thought that he was the Joker, and this was a Batman showing of the Dark Knight that he went to do this act of terrorism. And he also thought that he wasn't going to live through the incident, so he booby-trapped his apartment. He had obvious evidence of planning in there, and he knew that the police would go there, so to invoke more terror when they got there, he wanted them to also fall victim to his plan. So being obsessed with Batman, he chose this theater because he didn't want it to be confused. He thought an airport would look like terrorism, and his quote is that terrorism isn't the message is there is no message. So he's doing this cosplay, this personification of the Joker, the whole idea that some people just want to see the world burn. So he enters a plea of insanity, and the court actually accepts it. Unlike with Jeffrey Dahmer, they're like, yes, we're going to accept your plea of insanity, but he definitely did not get off. He got 12 consecutive life sentences plus 3,318 years without parole. Now, to put that into context, the sentence that this guy was given by the court is pretty much all of written history. This is way before BC, in the Stone Age, that 4,000 years ago would encompass. So he's the only mass shooter so far that has lived through what they've been doing. Nicholas Cruz is the other one. He's the shooter in Parkland, and we'll have information on him later, but other than that, these mass shooters do not survive. I don't know if there's justice in giving somebody that atrocious of a sentence. A human lifespan is only as long as a human can live, so anything that's on top of that is pretty ridiculous. There's no justice in there. It's not something that's going to affect anybody in any way, but it is a way that the court is looking to try to deal with some of these instances of people doing these acts that are beyond what most of us can comprehend. So we have seen that the definition of insanity has changed over time as it's presented to the court. It's really important that we know that this is a legal term, a legal vocabulary. It is not a psychological, scientific term. You don't get diagnosed as being insane. It's a defense that's used in the courtroom to show that the mentally ill person should not be held criminally responsible because they don't understand that what they're doing is wrong. They don't know that what's happening is a bad thing. A couple of things are going to come into play. There's going to be 2 times that they're going to test the mental competency of the person that is on trial. The first one is at the trial. They'll give you a psychological evaluation before the trial begins to see if the person is competent to stand trial. That's what happened in the case of Jeffrey Dahmer. He was obviously mentally ill. He had diagnosis beforehand showing different psychological disorders that he suffered from, but at the trial he was competent to stand trial, so he couldn't plead insanity in that way. They're also going to try to prove competency or sanity during the crime. What was the mental state of the person when the crime was taking place? So there's those two distinctions that are going to be taken into account for this kind of defense. Now, in most states, there's 3 different verdicts that the court can issue. The first one is guilty, that you did this crime, you're going to suffer the consequences of it. We have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that you are the perpetrator in this instance. The second one is not guilty. There's not enough evidence, there's a hung jury, there is a reasonable doubt that you are not the person that committed this crime. And then the third one is not guilty by reason of insanity. And of course, this, as we've seen, has evolved over time. The types of crimes that are brought to the court and the consequences that the court is issuing because of this type of verdict. Now, there's a new verdict that's been added, which is guilty but mentally ill. So that's just a small distinction that shows, okay, you are guilty of this crime. We're not going to say that you're not guilty of it, but you are severely mentally ill, and the consequences are going to change because of that, as far as where you're held, how you're dealt with when you go and carry out your sentence. The burden of proof is still going to shift to the defense anytime that this insanity plea is issued to the court. You're saying that yes, you committed the crime, so the prosecution doesn't have to prove that. You are now responsible to prove that you were mentally ill at the time, that you do not have responsibility, you didn't understand right and wrong. Expert testimony, psychologists, psychiatrists, different people in the medical profession are going to be the ones to testify to try to prove insanity for a defendant. But it's still a very small portion of court cases that use. So that does it for our look at the insanity defense and its evolution throughout time in the United States. Of course, there's other ways to look at it. We can use different examples, different cases. These are just ones that stood out to me that I wanted to convey to you guys to show how it has changed over time and how it's used in the courtroom. But we're going to look at this from a psychological perspective. What is this evil thing? Why is that word thrown around? Where did evil come from? We're going to build our gradations of evil scale. We're going to start looking at different types of cases and different motives that people would have to commit some of the crimes that they have, different reactions from the public. Why do we feel the way that we do, and why do we do some of the things that we do as human beings? So this should be fascinating to study. I look forward to this term with you guys. Have a great day.